On a stormy night in Riverdale, a little girl named Marie walked into the police station, clutching an X-ray against her chest as if it was her last piece of truth. Her voice trembled, but beside her stood Brody, the German shepherd whose quiet strength would change everything. In the glow of flickering lights, the bond between a wounded child and a loyal dog began to unfold, revealing secrets long buried behind closed doors. What did Brody sense that no one else could see? Watch this powerful story to discover the truth. Riverdale lay under heavy rain, a town wrapped in silence that was broken only by the rhythm of water striking rooftops and empty streets. Street lamps shone like pale halos through the downpour, their light bending across puddles and running into dark gutters. Houses lined the streets in neat rows, but curtains were drawn tight, windows fogged with warmth from families inside. Outside, the storm ruled. At the far edge of town, the small brick police station held its place, like a lone outpost against the weather. The glass doors rattled whenever a gust pressed against them. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of coffee left too long in its pot. Fluorescent lights hummed above metal desks where files lay stacked in uneven piles. Phones rang at intervals, their shrill tone fading into the steady tick of the wall clock. It was a simple night. Officers finished reports, exchanged brief words, and waited for the long hours to pass. The storm seemed endless, the kind that pressed against every wall and ceiling. In that stillness, a child arrived. The front door creaked open with the weight of damp air rushing inside. A little girl stepped through her shoulders, hunched beneath a raincoat too large for her small frame. She could not have been more than 8 years old. The coat hung past her knees, dripping steadily onto the tiled floor. Her shoes left faint, wet marks behind her fragile patterns across the linoleum. Her name was Marie Bennett. She held something tight against her chest, wrapped in clear plastic. The edges of the film curled slightly under her grip. It was an X-ray pressed to her as if it were her final piece of truth. Her light brown hair clung to her forehead in damp strands. Hazel eyes, wide and restless, flickered around the room. They carried the look of someone far older than 8 years, a mixture of fear and determination. Every step she took was hesitant, as though she was unsure if she was welcome here, unsure if anyone would listen. The station seemed too large for her presence. Desks stood like tall barriers, uniforms moved in and out of doors, and the clock continued its measured tick. Against all of it, Marie looked impossibly small, yet her grip on the film never loosened. At the front desk sat Sergeant Donna Murphy. She was in her 50s, her glasses perched low on her nose as she read through reports. Her build was sturdy, her hair gathered neatly in a bun. Lines on her face told of long service, but her eyes carried softness. She looked up, startled for a moment by the sight of the drenched child. "Sweetheart," she said gently, sliding her glasses down. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" Marie's lips trembled before sound escaped. "I need to talk to a police officer." Her voice was steady, but the tremor beneath it betrayed exhaustion and fear. The room shifted with those words. Donna set aside her papers, rising with the calm of experience. She had seen frightened children before, but rarely one clutching hospital film with such desperate force. "Wait here a moment," she said kindly. "I'll get someone." Marie nodded faintly, though her eyes never lifted fully from the floor. She pulled the raincoat tighter around her thin frame. The storm outside pressed harder against the windows, rain tapping in restless rhythm. The child stood in silence, framed by humming lights and the echo of the clock. Behind her, the door closed with a soft click, cutting away the storm, but not the weight it had carried her through. The truth she held in her hands was about to reshape the lives of everyone who listened. From the hallway came the sound of boots on tile, slow and measured. And beside them, a softer rhythm. The pads of a German shepherd. The steady sound of boots grew closer each step, even and deliberate. A tall figure appeared in the doorway, his presence calm but unmistakably firm. His uniform was neat, yet unpretentious, the dark navy fabric pressed across broad shoulders. His jaw carried the shadow of a day's stubble, and his gray eyes seemed to hold both gravity and patience. This was Officer Nick Carter, 38 years old, a man who had given years of service to Riverdale's police department. Those who worked with him knew his quiet strength. They also knew the shadow he carried. 3 winters earlier, Nick had lost his wife in a car accident. Since then, he had moved through life with a steadiness born not of ease, but of surviving sorrow. His manner was never hurried, never careless. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, people listened. Beside him padded a large German shepherd, his thick sable coat shining even under the harsh fluorescent light. His ears stood sharp, his posture proud, and his amber eyes missed nothing. His name was Brody, 6 years old, a trained canine partner known across the station for his discipline. Yet beyond his training, Brody carried something more, a gentleness that children sensed at once. Sergeant Murphy gestured toward the girl standing in the middle of the lobby. "This little one asked for an officer," she said softly, and she brought something with her. Nick lowered himself slightly enough to meet the girl's line of sight without towering over her. His voice was steady, a calm anchor in the storm. "Hello," he said. "I'm Officer Carter. And this," he gestured to the shepherd sitting close by, "is my partner Brody." Marie's hazel eyes flicked to the dog. Brody tilted his head, studying her with a quiet intensity. Then, with deliberate ease, his tail brushed once across the floor. It was a simple gesture, but it carried warmth. For the first time since stepping inside, Marie's posture eased, if only slightly. Nick noticed. He had seen it before, the way children trusted animals when they were not ready to trust people. "He's very good at listening," Nick said gently. "You can tell him anything, and you can tell me too." For a moment, Marie hesitated, her fingers tightening around the item pressed against her chest. Then slowly, as though surrendering a secret she had guarded with all her strength, she held it out. Nick accepted it carefully. The plastic sleeve unrolled, revealing black and white shadows of ribs across the film. 2 of them were marked by pale, fractured lines. He held it up against the light, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. Years of training told him what it meant. A child's ribs broken by force. His eyes lifted back to the girl. She stood small and trembling, yet her gaze held a quiet plea. Nick knelt lower, softening his tone even further. "Marie," he said, "this is very important. You were right to bring it here." Her lips parted. Words rose fragile but steady. It was not an accident. The sentence landed heavy in the room. Sergeant Murphy's expression tightened. Brody shifted closer, his body angling protectively toward the girl. His amber eyes stayed fixed on her face, as though he already understood. Nick did not press for more, not yet. He had learned the weight of beginnings. Instead, he offered reassurance. "Thank you for trusting us, Marie. You're safe here." The clock ticked above them. Outside, the storm tapped harder against the windows, insistent, unrelenting. Inside the station, a fragile thread of truth had just been laid bare, one that would unravel into something larger than any of them yet realized. Nick glanced once more at the X-ray in his hands, then at the child before him. Brody sat steady at her side, a silent wall of loyalty. Together they formed a picture that spoke louder than words, a truth waiting to be told. Nick guided Marie into a small interview room at the back of the station. The walls were painted a soft cream dulled with time. A single lamp in the corner cast a warmer glow than the harsh lights outside, giving the space a gentler atmosphere. The table was scratched from years of use, and 2 chairs waited on either side. Marie sat on the edge of one chair, her raincoat dripping onto the mat beneath her shoes. She looked even smaller here, her legs not reaching the floor. On the table lay the X-ray, silent but undeniable. Brody curled on the floor beside her, his body angled protectively, ears flicking at every sound from the hallway. His presence filled the space like a steady guard. Nick took the opposite chair, his notebook open, but his pen resting quietly across the page. He leaned slightly forward, his posture calm, his hands open. He knew frightened children read more than words. They read pauses, gestures, even the way someone breathed. "Marie," he began, his voice steady, "you said it was not an accident." "We're in no rush. Take your time." Her hazel eyes flicked to Brody. Tentatively, she lowered her hand toward him. The shepherd lifted his head and pressed his muzzle gently against her palm. The contact drew a long breath from her chest, shaky but freeing. She stroked the fur along his neck, and when she finally spoke, her voice was small, but clear. "It was Megan," she said. "My sister." Nick wrote the name down carefully. "Megan," he repeated, his tone even. "She's older than you." "She's 13, Marie answered. "She's taller, everyone listens to her. When she gets angry, she hits." Her words came without rush, each one carrying the weight of truth practiced many times in silence. Nick kept his gaze steady. "Can you tell me what happened?" Marie's fingers tightened in Brody's fur. "It was last week. She wanted my toy horse. It was the only one I had from my birthday. I said no. She pushed me against the wall. Then she grabbed a chair and struck me here. She touched her side just below the ribs. I couldn't breathe. I fell down. I cried, but they did nothing." Nick's jaw flexed. "When you say they, who, do you mean Mom and Dad?" Marie whispered, lowering her head. "Mom told the doctor I fell down the stairs." She smiled while she said it like it was clever. Dad stood behind her. He didn't look at me. He never looks at me. The words settled heavy in the room. Nick let silence breathe so she would not feel pressed. The air vent hummed above them. Brody's steady breathing filled the gap. Marie lifted her chin again. Her eyes glimmered with something between fear and resolve. "They told me if I said anything different, no one would believe me. Megan gets good grades. She sings in the choir. She smiles for everyone. People think she's perfect." Nick studied her face. She was 8, yet her tone carried the weight of someone who had learned secrecy too early. The fractured lines on the X-ray echoed the fractured lines of her childhood. Brody shifted closer, resting his head against her leg. His warmth steadied her, as if confirming that her words mattered. Nick closed his notebook gently. He had heard enough to know. The truth had begun to surface. This was no simple family quarrel. This was a case of violence hidden behind painted walls. He looked at Marie, then at Brody. The child and the dog were bound by trust already. And that trust gave her courage. Nick felt the shape of his next steps forming. Evidence would be gathered, lies would be tested, and justice would be sought. Nick left the interview room for a moment, giving Marie space to breathe. Sergeant Murphy stayed with the child, offering her a blanket and a quiet presence. Brody padded beside Nick down the hall, his nails clicking softly on the tile. Nick paused near a window. Rain streaked the glass, blurring the shapes of streetlights outside. He stood still, the X-ray film still in his hand. The image of broken ribs pulled his mind backward into a memory that had never left him. It had been 3 winters earlier. Snow had fallen hard that night, covering Riverdale's roads in white. His wife, Clara, had been driving home from visiting her sister. Nick remembered the phone call, the rush to the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic. He remembered the way doctors spoke in careful tones, words he could barely absorb. By the time he reached her side, she was already gone. The house afterward felt like a shell. Empty rooms echoed louder than any storm. For weeks, Nick wandered from one room to another, his silence broken only by the tick of clocks and the hum of the refrigerator. He barely ate. Nights were worse. The bed felt vast and cold, the quiet unbearable. Brody had been young then, still in training. Yet he had sensed the weight pressing down on Nick. On those nights, the dog would rest his head on Nick's knee or curl against the bed frame, his breathing steady in the darkness. It was not words that saved Nick, but presence. The simple reminder that he was not alone. Nick exhaled heavily, pulling himself back from memory. Now in the present, he looked down at Brody. The German shepherd stood at his side, amber eyes steady, as if aware of what his partner was reliving. "You pulled me through once?" Nick murmured quietly. Brody's ears twitched, his gaze fixed on Nick's face. "And now it looks like you're here for her too." He thought of Marie, her trembling voice, the quiet plea in her eyes. She reminded him of the loneliness he had once carried. The feeling of shouting into silence, of being unseen. The difference was that she was a child, and her silence had been forced upon her by those who should have protected her. Nick's jaw tightened. He had promised himself after Clara's death that he would keep serving, but more than that, he would listen for the voices too easily ignored. Marie's voice was one of those, and Brody once again had stepped into the center of someone's darkest hour. He crouched, resting a hand on Brody's strong shoulder. "We'll protect her," he said low, but certain. "We'll see this through." Brody pressed his head lightly against Nick's palm, the gesture carrying the weight of agreement. For a moment, Nick stayed like that, steadying himself in the familiar comfort of his partner's loyalty. Then he rose, the X-ray still firm in his grip. The rain continued to lash against the windows, but inside Nick felt the clarity of a new resolve. He walked back toward the interview room. The hum of the station surrounded him. Again, phones ringing, voices carrying down the hall. But his focus had sharpened. This was no longer just another case file. It was a child's survival. It was the line between silence and truth. Nick opened the door. Marie sat where he had left her, wrapped in a blanket, Brody immediately circling back to her side. The girl lifted her eyes, uncertain but searching. Nick gave a small nod, his voice calm but firm. "Marie, let's sit together a little longer. There are things you can tell us, and I'll listen." The interview room was small, painted in neutral colors that had faded over years of use. A single lamp cast a soft glow warmer than the harsh overhead lights in the rest of the station. The steady hum of the air vent filled the silence, offering a strange kind of company. Marie sat at the table, her thin frame wrapped in the blanket Sergeant Murphy had given her. The fabric looked oversized against her shoulders, but it carried a bit of comfort. Her damp hair clung to her temples, and her eyes lingered on the X-ray film that now rested between her and Nick. Brody lay on the floor at her side, his body angled protectively toward her chair. His amber eyes lifted to her every few moments, as if reminding her that she was not alone. Every so often, his tail brushed once across the floor, steady and grounding. Nick opened his notebook. His pen rested lightly between his fingers. He leaned forward slightly, careful not to intrude. "Marie," he said gently, "I want you to tell me what happened. Take your time. Brody and I are right here." Marie's small hand reached down. Brody raised his head and placed his muzzle on her lap. She stroked the thick fur at his neck, her fingers trembling at first, then steadying with the comfort of his presence. She took a long breath. "It was the chair," she whispered. Nick gave a slight nod, encouraging her to continue. "She pushed me first, Megan. She shoved me into the wall because I wouldn't give her my horse. Then she pulled the chair from the table. She hit me here." Marie touched her side just under the blanket, her movement cautious. It felt like my chest cracked. I couldn't breathe. The words came slowly, but they carried the weight of memory too vivid to be imagined. Nick's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone calm. And after that, Marie's gaze lowered to the table. I fell to the floor. I cried, but Mom told me to be quiet. She said I was dramatic. Dad stood in the doorway. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just watched. The silence that followed pressed down on the room. Marie's shoulders hunched as though expecting disbelief. But Brody shifted closer, resting his head fully on her lap now. His warm breath rose and fell against her blanket. The gesture pulled a shaky exhale from her chest. She leaned into him, her small hands clutching the fur around his neck. Nick kept his voice low. "You've been carrying this alone. That must have been heavy." Her hazel eyes lifted, searching his face for any trace of doubt. What she found was steady patience. She nodded her lips, pressing together, as if the words themselves had worn her thin. Nick glanced down at his notes, the fractured ribs on the X-ray echoing her account with painful clarity. A broken chair, a blow delivered with force parents who had chosen silence over protection. The story aligned in ways that were undeniable. He set his pen down carefully. "Marie, thank you for telling us. You've been very brave. Everything you've said matters. And I promise you, we will look deeper." Her small hand still clung to Brody, who remained unmoving except for the steady thump of his tail against the floor. For the first time since stepping into the station, her posture eased just slightly. Nick closed his notebook, his thoughts already turning to the next step. He would need to write his report carefully with every detail intact. And then he would need a warrant. The rain pressed harder against the station windows, as if echoing urgency. Nick rose, looking once more at the fragile figure before him. Nick sat at his desk long after the rest of the station had quieted. The storm outside rattled against the windows, steady and unrelenting. His notebook lay open, pages already filled with Marie's words. He read them again, tracing each line with care, making sure nothing was lost. Every detail mattered. The X-ray rested beside the notebook. The fractured ribs glowed faintly under the desk lamp, stark reminders of the violence that had been passed off as accident. Beside the lamp sat a single coffee cup, forgotten and cold. Nick ignored it. His pen moved slowly, deliberately across the page as he wrote his official report. He described Marie's arrival at the station, soaked through her raincoat. He wrote of her fear, her trembling voice, and the way Brody's presence allowed her to speak. He included her description of Megan's actions, the blow with the chair, and the silent roles of Robert and Vanessa. Each word was set down with precision, free of exaggeration, grounded in fact. When the report was complete, Nick placed it in a folder and rose. The station halls were dim-lined with closed doors. He walked toward the corner office where the chief worked late hours, light spilling beneath the door. Brody padded beside him, quiet but alert. Nick knocked once and entered. Chief Wallace, a man in his 60s with silver hair cropped close, looked up from his desk. His build was solid, his expression one of cautious patience. Years of service had made him skeptical, slow to move without proof. He set aside his glasses as Nick placed the folder in front of him. "Report on the Bennett case." Nick said, his tone calm but firm. "I'm requesting a search warrant for their home." Wallace leaned back, scanning the first pages. His eyes narrowed. "This is serious, Carter. You're asking me to authorize a warrant against a family known for being respectable. They've lived here for years. Teachers know them. Neighbors praise them. You're basing this on the word of an 8-year-old. Nick did not flinch. On the word of a child holding medical proof. On fractures no fall down the stairs could cause. And on her description that matches the injury exactly." Wallace sighed, fingers tapping against the file. He was not a man to be swayed easily. Children sometimes confuse details. They imagine things. You know that. At that moment, the door opened slightly. Sergeant Murphy stepped in with Marie wrapped still in her blanket. She had asked to see Nick, but now she stood uncertain, her hazel eyes shifting toward the chief. Brody moved instantly to her side, pressing close, his amber eyes fixed steady on her face. Wallace looked at the child. She said nothing, only clutched the shepherd's fur, her small body leaning into him. In her silence there was truth. Truth carried in the way her shoulders shook, in the way her eyes pleaded to be believed. The chief exhaled slowly, the resistance in him softening. He looked again at Nick. "You believe her." Nick's voice was steady. "I do, and so does Brody." Wallace studied the shepherd, who sat tall, unwavering, as though ready to guard the girl against the whole world. After a long pause, the chief closed the folder. "Very well," Wallace said. "I'll approve your request. Get the paperwork to the judge first thing in the morning." Nick gave a firm nod. Relief was not in his expression, only resolve. This was the first step, and there was more ahead. He turned to Marie, crouching slightly so she could see his face. "We're moving forward," he told her. She pressed her face into Brody's neck, and the shepherd's tail brushed once against the floor, steady and sure. Morning light broke through thinning clouds, leaving the streets of Riverdale slick with rain. The storm had passed, but the air still smelled of wet earth and damp leaves. Nick drove slowly through quiet neighborhoods, his cruiser humming steadily along the paved road. Brody sat upright in the passenger seat, alert, as always, his amber eyes fixed on the passing houses. Ahead, the Bennett residence came into view. It looked like a postcard, an image crafted to reassure anyone who glanced its way. A tall white gate framed the yard, the paint fresh and even. Beyond it stretched a tidy lawn, trimmed to perfection. Rows of flowers lined the walkway, marigolds and daisies, standing in careful order. The house itself rose 2 stories, painted cream with navy shutters. Windows gleamed under the sunlight, spotless and proud. To a passerby, it spoke of family photos above the fireplace. Summer evenings on the porch, and laughter spilling out of open windows. Yet Nick knew better. He had seen too many polished surfaces hiding rot beneath. He parked along the curb. Brody's ears twitched as he studied the property. The dog's posture stiffened slightly, his gaze drawn to the stillness of the place, as though the house itself carried unease. Nick stepped out, boots pressing against the damp sidewalk. Brody followed at his side, his stride measured every step a mirror of his handler's. Together they walked through the gate, its hinges creaking faintly, and up the polished path to the front door. A moment later, the door opened. Robert Bennett stood in the frame. He was in his mid-40s, of average build, but carrying a heaviness in his posture as though every step cost effort. His thinning dark hair was combed neatly, his shirt pressed his khakis chosen with deliberate care. His eyes, dark brown and guarded, met Nick's with polite distance. Officer Carter Roberts said evenly, his voice polite but rehearsed, "What brings you here this morning?" Nick introduced himself with a calm nod. Brody sat tall at his side, eyes fixed steadily on the man. From behind, Robert came Vanessa Bennett, tall and slender. Her blonde hair styled in a sharp bob, she wore a cardigan over a floral blouse, pearl earrings glinting in the doorway. Her smile was practiced, her voice high-pitched and warm on the surface. "Officer, what a surprise. I hope everything is all right. Our family tries to keep things quiet. We value peace in this home." Nick studied her expression. Her smile was broad, but her eyes darted quickly toward Brody before returning to his face. And then stepping into view was Megan Bennett. At 13, she stood with unusual composure, her posture straight, her long dark hair pulled back neatly. She wore jeans and a clean sweatshirt, her sneakers spotless. A faint smile curved her lips, steady and unshaken, as though she had rehearsed it. "Hello," Megan said, her tone smooth and confident. Her gaze flicked briefly toward Brody, then back to Nick with a hint of curiosity rather than fear. To anyone watching, the family looked perfect. Father, polite; mother, gracious; daughter, poised. But Nick had learned to read between lines to see past neat facades. He felt Brody shift beside him. The shepherd's ears pricked forward, his chest rising with a deeper breath. Nick cleared his throat, his voice steady. "I'd like to speak with you about some matters concerning your daughter Marie." The air at the doorway seemed to tighten. Vanessa's smile wavered for a fraction of a second before she brightened it again. Robert shifted his stance. Megan's faint smile remained, but her eyes grew sharper, calculating. Nick made note of it all. Brody's body had gone still, his gaze fixed as though sensing what lingered behind painted walls and polished words. The Bennetts led Nick and Brody into the living room, a space designed to impress. The furniture gleamed with polished family portraits lined the walls in perfect frames, and a vase of lilies sat centered on the coffee table. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, as though every detail had been prepared for visitors. Megan settled into an armchair with ease, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked at Nick with wide, practiced eyes and the faint smile of a girl eager to be seen as mature. "Marie likes to make up stories," Megan began, her tone light and almost sympathetic. "She always has. Sometimes she pretends she's a princess. Sometimes she says she's sick when she just wants attention. I guess this time she went too far." Vanessa, standing behind the couch, gave a quick nod as if confirming the point. "You know how children are," she added smoothly. "Imagination can get carried away. Marie has always been dramatic." Robert shifted in his chair, adjusting his cuff as though the fabric were suddenly too tight. He said nothing, his silence heavy, but his presence loomed like a wall behind Vanessa's words. Nick studied Megan carefully. Her voice was calm, steady, without the nervous cracks most children carried under questioning. It was too perfect, too measured. He had heard seasoned adults struggle more under simple inquiry. And the X-ray? Nick asked evenly, his eyes steady on hers. Megan's faint smile did not falter. She probably fell. "She trips a lot. Marie is clumsy. She never pays attention." Vanessa stepped in again. "Exactly what we told the doctor. She must have fallen down the stairs." That would explain everything. Her smile was wide, bright, but her pale blue eyes flickered toward Brody. The German shepherd had not moved since entering the room, but now his ears pricked sharply. His amber gaze swept across the space, nostrils flaring. He stood body tense and paced slowly toward the hallway. Megan's eyes followed him for a moment, her smile thinning before she quickly recovered. "Even Brody seems restless," she said softly, trying to sound amused. "Maybe he smells the flowers." Nick's gaze shifted briefly to his partner. He knew that posture. The sharp ears, the stiff tail, the way Brody's nose tested the air. The dog had caught something out of place. Nick turned back to Megan. "Marie says you struck her with a chair." "What do you say to that?" Megan gave a practiced laugh, light but hollow. "That's silly. Why would I do that?" "She probably imagined it. Maybe she bumped into something and decided it was me. Marie doesn't like it when she doesn't get her way." Vanessa folded her arms. "Officer, you can see how this looks. We have a daughter who imagines things and tells stories. We've done our best to guide her, but she insists on turning small accidents into tragedies." Nick noted the rhythm of their words, the neat alignment of their excuses. It was too rehearsed. Years of lies tended to sound like that. He jotted a line in his notebook, his expression calm, though his mind was sharp. Brody returned to his side, but his body remained tense. His ears stayed forward, nose working the air, his attention fixed down the hall. The shepherd gave a low rumble, not loud, but enough for Nick to catch. Nick closed his notebook with care. "Thank you for your answers," he said simply. His tone gave nothing away. But his eyes followed Brody's silent signals. The Bennett's living room felt staged, every detail arranged like a performance. Yet Brody's body told another story. The shepherd's muscles stayed taut, his ears angled forward, his amber eyes locked on the hallway. Nick rose slowly from his chair. "I'd like to take a brief look around the house," he said evenly. His notebook closing with a quiet snap. Routine observation. Robert's shoulders stiffened. Vanessa's smile froze in place. Megan tilted her head slightly still, wearing that faint, unbroken smile. Nick did not wait for permission. He followed Brody's lead, his boots steady on the hardwood floor. Brody padded ahead, nose working the airtail held stiff. The shepherd moved with purpose, each step narrowing the distance toward the end of the hall. The house was silent, but for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Family portraits lined the walls, smiles, two wide eyes, too polished. Then Brody stopped. His body froze before a closed door at the far end of the hall. He pressed his nose against the wood, inhaling sharply, then barked once. The sound was loud, deep resonant, cutting through the house like thunder. Nick's gaze hardened. Robert hurried forward, hands raised. "That's just storage," he said quickly. "Old furniture boxes. Nothing more." Vanessa joined him, her voice bright too fast. "We keep extra decorations there, officer. You can understand. We don't want anyone poking around in a messy storage room." Brody barked again, pawing at the bottom of the door, his claws clicking against the wood. His amber eyes flicked back toward Nick, demanding attention. Nick crouched, slightly inspecting the lock. It was newer than the others in the house, a small detail, but telling. He straightened, writing a single line in his notebook. "Locked door, end of hall." Strong reaction from Brody. Owner's defensive. Vanessa moved quickly, blocking his path. Her smile tightened the pearls at her ears, trembling slightly as she spoke. "Officer, really, this is unnecessary. You came here to ask questions, not to wander through our private rooms." Nick's tone remained steady, his gray eyes unwavering. "Private rooms can remain private if there is nothing to hide." Megan appeared at the edge of the hall, leaning against the wall with arms crossed. Her faint smile lingered, but her fingers twisted against her sleeve, a flicker of tension breaking her mask. Nick took note of it all, Robert's rigid posture, Vanessa's forced brightness, Megan's cool performance cracking at the edges. And Brody, silent now but standing guard before the door, tail stiff chest rising with slow, deliberate breaths. Robert tried again, his voice strained. "You don't need to concern yourself with that room. There is nothing in there. Just old things." Nick clicked his pen and wrote another line. Verbal resistance noted. Subjects attempting to redirect. The weight of the moment pressed down. He knew he would not open that door today, not without the judge's signature. But the locked room had spoken louder than any denial. Brody had made sure of that. Nick gave a calm nod, stepping back slightly. "I appreciate your time," he said. "I'll be in touch." His tone revealed nothing, but his notes told the truth. As he and Brody walked back toward the front of the house, he felt Megan's eyes on him. Her smile never wavered, but beneath it, Nick sensed a flicker of defiance, or fear. The front door closed behind them. Outside, the air was sharp with the scent of wet grass and marigolds. Nick looked down at Brody, who glanced back at the house with ears still pricked. "Good work," Nick murmured. Brody gave a low chuff, his gaze unyielding on the white gate they had just passed. The following morning, the courthouse in Riverdale carried its usual air of quiet gravity. Wooden benches lined the hallways, and the scent of polished oak lingered in the air. Nick walked with purpose, a file tucked beneath his arm, Brody moving steadily at his side. Inside the judge's chambers, the walls were lined with books, whose spines bore the weight of decades of law. Judge Ellison, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled neatly into a bun, sat behind her desk. Her sharp eyes studied Nick as he placed the file in front of her. "You're requesting a search of the Bennett residence?" She said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Explain why." Nick spoke clearly. He described Marie's testimony, the X-ray film showing fractured ribs, the girl's quiet fear, and the locked room at the end of the hall. He emphasized Brody's response, the shepherd's instinct untrained for lies, but sharp for truth. Judge Ellison leaned back, her gaze steady. A respectable family on the outside. Yet your note suggests something else. You understand this will stir talk. I do, Nick replied firmly. But I'm not here for appearances. I'm here for the child who trusted us. The room held silence for a beat. Then the judge picked up her pen, signed the document, and slid it across the desk. You have your warrant, Officer Carter. Use it wisely. Nick accepted it with a nod. Brody's ears flicked as if sensing the weight of the moment. By late afternoon, Nick returned to the station. He gathered his team, Detective Ruiz, sharp-eyed and seasoned, and Officer Daniels, younger but eager. Each reviewed the plan, each understood the risk of resistance. As the sun began to dip, their cruiser rolled once again toward the Bennett home. Brody sat poised, muscles taut beneath his sable coat, amber eyes locked on the road ahead. Nick's jaw tightened as the white gate came into view, gleaming under the fading light. This time the visit carried authority. Nick stepped out, first warrant in hand, Brody close at his side. Ruiz followed, scanning the property with a professional eye. Daniels carried the evidence kit, his steps quick but careful. Robert opened the door after a pause, his face pale, his eyes darting to the uniformed officers behind Nick. This is unnecessary, he muttered, but his voice carried no strength. Vanessa appeared in the hallway, her smile brittle, her pearl earrings trembling with each breath. Officer Carter, we explained everything. Surely you don't need to do this. Nick held up the document. Judge Ellison has granted a search of the premises, including the locked room. Vanessa's face drained of color. Robert's jaw tightened. From the stairs, Megan leaned against the banister, her calm smile still intact, though her eyes flickered quickly toward Brody. The shepherd's gaze locked on her, unblinking. Nick and his team entered. The air inside felt heavier this time, as though the house itself knew its secrets were about to be torn open. Brody led the way, nose low, body vibrating with alertness. He paused once, then pulled toward the hallway with steady force. Ruiz glanced at Nick. He knows. Nick nodded. His hand brushed the notebook in his pocket where the line locked door, strong reaction, had been written the day before. The officers reached the end of the hall. The door stood closed, the new lock glinting under the dim light. Brody pressed his paw against the bottom, his chest rumbling low. Nick held the warrant up once more. His voice was steady, firm. We're opening this. Robert's protest died in his throat. Vanessa clutched her cardigan tight. Megan remained silent, but her fingers twisted against her sleeve, the smile on her lips beginning to falter. Ruiz knelt with her tools, metal scraped against metal as she worked. The lock gave way with a sharp click. Nick exhaled, his eyes on the door. Brody pressed closer, muscles coiled, ears pricked. The door swung open with a slow creak, hinges groaning as if reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. The officer stepped back, allowing Brody to move first. The shepherd padded into the dark space, his nails clicking against the worn floorboards. His nose pressed low, tail stiff, every sense alive. Nick followed with his flashlight. The beam cut across the room, revealing chaos hidden behind a facade of order. The air smelled stale, layered with dust and something metallic beneath. At the center of the floor lay a broken chair, one leg splintered. The seat cracked in two. The sight struck Nick with the weight of Marie's words. She hit me with a chair. I couldn't breathe. Beside the chair, fabric scraps clung to the carpet, one stained dark with a rusty blotch. Nick crouched, his gloved hand hovering above the fabric. Blood. His chest tightened. On a shelf by the window sat a slim notebook, its cover worn. Ruiz picked it up carefully with gloved hands. She flipped through the pages, her brow hardening. Line after line, written in looping cursive, fell downstairs, tripped on rug, slipped in bathtub. excuses rehearsed and cataloged. "This isn't a diary," Ruiz muttered. "It's a script. Cover stories." Nick nodded, his jaw tightening. Years of practice. Behind them, Robert's voice wavered from the hall. "You're twisting everything. That's just old junk. Kids break things. Accidents happen." Nick ignored him. His eyes followed Brody, who had pressed against the far wall. The dog pawed at a stack of boxes, nose digging insistently. Nick stepped over, pulling the boxes aside. Brody pushed his muzzle deeper, then drew back with a low growl, something pale caught between his teeth. Nick's heart clenched as he took the object. A torn strip of fabric, pink once, now dulled by dust. A child's shirt. Along its edge, a patch of dried blood. The silence in the room grew heavy. Even the hum of the house seemed to fade beneath the weight of what they had uncovered. Nick placed the fabric into an evidence bag, sealing it with steady hands. Ruiz held up the notebook. "This alone destroys their story. No parent keeps a log of lies unless they know the truth will surface one day." Nick's gaze swept the room once more, the shattered chair, the stained fabric, the catalog of excuses. Each piece alone was suspicious. Together, they were undeniable. Brody sat back on his haunches, eyes fixed on Nick as if asking what came next. His chest rose and fell, but he remained still, a sentinel among ruins. Nick rose, turning toward the hallway. Vanessa stood rigid, her hand clutching the banister. Her eyes darted between the evidence bags, the officers, and the dog. Her smile had vanished, replaced by a brittle tension. Robert stayed half hidden in shadow, lips pressed, thin silence his only defense. Megan, at the top of the stairs, still wore her calm expression. Her arms were folded, her eyes sharp, watching every move with unsettling poise. Yet Nick saw it. The faint crack in her composure, the tightening at the corner of her mouth. Nick spoke firmly. "We have what we need." Ruiz nodded, already labeling the evidence bags. Daniels photographed the scene, each flash of the camera cutting through the heavy air. Brody gave a low huff. Amber eyes still locked on Megan. The flashes from Daniel's camera faded, leaving the room steeped in a heavy silence. Evidence bags stacked neatly on the table, the shattered chair leg, the blood-stained cloth, the slim notebook filled with years of excuses. Each piece told a story the Bennetts had tried to bury. Vanessa was the first to speak. Her voice trembled at the edges, but she fought to keep it steady. "Children get hurt all the time," she said quickly. "Bruises, scrapes, broken bones even. It happens. You're twisting this into something it isn't." Nick faced her squarely. A scraped knee is one thing. A rib broken by blunt force is another. And no parent keeps a record of false explanations unless they know the truth is darker. Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes darted toward the evidence bags, then back at Nick. "You don't understand. We were just trying to protect our family, to keep appearances. Sometimes little lies are better than gossip." Detective Ruiz stepped forward, holding the notebook in a gloved hand. Her tone was sharp, precise. "This isn't little lies. These are rehearsed cover stories, line after line, page after page. A log of deceit. That's not protection. That's concealment." Robert shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. His silence stretched longer, heavier. When his wife glanced at him for support, he looked away, his jaw clenched. His muteness was its own confession. Vanessa's voice rose, desperation bleeding into her tone. "You don't know Megan. She's a good girl, smart, talented. Everyone at school says so. She wouldn't hurt her sister. Marie is imaginative, fragile. She makes things up, always has." Nick's gray eyes narrowed. Marie came to us soaked in rain, clutching proof against her chest. That wasn't imagination. That was survival. Brody let out a low growl, soft but unmistakable, his eyes locked on Megan at the top of the stairs. The girl stood still, arms folded across her chest, her face composed. Yet the faint smile that had lingered so effortlessly now trembled at the corners. She tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, almost detached. Marie lies. She always lies. You're making a mistake listening to her. Ruiz lifted the notebook higher. Then explain this. Explain why your parents needed to keep track of every supposed accident. Why a chair lies shattered in this room. Why there's blood on a child's shirt. For the first time, Megan's gaze wavered. Her smile flickered, faltering for a heartbeat before she forced it back into place. Nick saw it. The hairline crack in her mask. A fracture no less real than the ones on Marie's ribs. Vanessa reached for her daughter's defense again, her voice breaking. She's only 13. Children fight. They push, they shout. It doesn't mean... Nick cut her off, his voice firm. Children fight, yes. But they don't break bones and then bury the truth behind lies. This wasn't a scuffle. This was abuse. And you stood by while it happened. The words landed like stones. Vanessa's face drained of color. Robert's shoulders slumped deeper, his silence absolute. Megan remained on the stairs, her expression calm but strained, the smile on her lips trembling as though it were held by threads. She did not speak again. Nick turned to Ruiz. Log everything. This evidence speaks louder than excuses. Brody shifted closer to his handler, his gaze never leaving the girl above. His ears stayed high, his body tense. Night fell heavy over Riverdale. Clouds rolled in low, their bellies swollen with rain. By the time darkness settled over the Bennett home, the storm had begun. Sheets of water lashed against the white gate, thunder cracked across the sky, and the house groaned under the weight of wind and water. Inside, the air felt tighter than the storm outside. The officers had left evidence, secured promises of justice spoken. But Marie was still in the house, waiting under temporary supervision while the paperwork moved through channels. She sat curled on the living room couch, her small frame wrapped in a blanket, her hazel eyes fixed on the storm outside. Brody lay near her feet, his body angled protectively, every sound from the thunder matched by the flick of his ears. His breathing was steady, but his muscles stayed tense as if he knew the night held more than rain. Megan appeared at the edge of the room. She no longer wore her neat composure like armor. Her dark hair clung damply to her face, her eyes glinting under the flicker of lightning. She stepped closer, slow, deliberate, her voice cutting through the thunder. "You think you're clever?" She hissed, her words aimed at Marie. "Running to the police, dragging strangers into this house. You think anyone will believe you over me?" Marie shrank into the blanket, her small hands clutching its edges. Her lips parted, but no words came. From the kitchen doorway, Vanessa stood watching, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Robert lingered in the shadows near the hall. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Their silence was a wall, cold, immovable, complicit. Megan's voice rose sharp and venomous. "You're nothing but a problem, and problems get fixed." She lunged forward, her lean frame coiled with fury, her hand raised to strike. The thunder outside roared, rattling the windows, but it was not enough to drown the sound of her footsteps pounding across the carpet. Marie's eyes widened, terror flashing across her face. She pressed back against the couch cushions, her body small and fragile beneath the storm's echo. Brody rose in an instant. His nails scraped against the floor as he surged forward, placing his body between Marie and her sister. His chest rumbled low, a sound rolling out like the thunder itself. His amber eyes burned in the dim light, fixed on Megan with unyielding force. She froze mid-stride, her arm still lifted. For a moment the mask she wore cracked fully, her smile gone, replaced by raw anger twisting her features. "Call him off!" Megan shouted, her voice shrill against the storm, but her words rang hollow, trembling at the edges. Behind her, Vanessa's lips parted, but no defense came. Robert's eyes lowered to the floor, his silence heavier than any thunderclap. They stood by motionless, unwilling to intervene. Brody's growl deepened, his body rigid, his tail stiff as a rod. The storm outside surged louder, lightning flashing across the windows, but the greater storm brewed inside the living room. Marie clutched the blanket tighter. Her hazel eyes locked on the shepherd, who now stood as her shield. Her small fingers reached toward him, finding courage in his steady form. Megan lowered her arms slowly, her eyes narrowing. She stepped back once, but her defiance still lingered, a spark waiting to ignite again. Brody did not move. His chest rumbled steady, a warning etched into the heart of the storm. The storm rattled the windows, its roar blending with Brody's deep growl. The shepherd's stance was unyielding. Shoulders squared, ears pricked, teeth bared just enough to glint in the flicker of lightning. His body was a wall of muscle and loyalty, planted firmly between Marie and Megan. Megan took another step forward, her anger flaring in the glow of the storm. "She ruins everything." She spat, her voice sharp and unsteady. Her fists tightened, her jaw trembling. Yet when Brody advanced a single stride, the sound that burst from his chest made her flinch. The growl rolled like thunder, shaking the air, commanding the room in a way no human voice could. Megan's face paled. Her bravado cracked. She stumbled back a pace, her eyes darting to her parents as though expecting them to act. But Vanessa clung to the doorway, her knuckles white around the frame. Robert stayed slumped in the hall's shadow, his silence heavier than stone. Neither lifted a hand. Neither spoke. Their passivity allowed the storm inside to rage unchecked. Marie rose from the couch, her small frame trembling, but driven by a spark of courage. She pressed one hand to Brody's back, steadying herself with the warmth of his fur. "Please," she whispered, though whether to herself or to him, even she could not tell. Brody barked suddenly, one sharp, resonant sound that split the storm's rhythm. The command of it startled Megan, forcing her a step further back toward the staircase. The girl's defiance faltered, her lips quivering, though her eyes still burned with something darker. Lightning flashed, filling the room with white glare. In that instant, Marie made her choice. She clutched Brody's collar with one hand, the blanket falling away from her shoulders, and whispered, "Come on." The shepherd moved with her, steady and sure. Together they darted toward the back door, the hinges rattling as Marie shoved it open. Rain swept inside, cold and merciless, but it was freedom. Megan's scream cut through the air behind them, raw and piercing. "Get back here." But Marie didn't look back. Barefoot, she splashed into the downpour, the storm soaking her nightgown until it clung to her fragile frame. The X-ray envelope, damp but still clutched tightly against her chest, bent beneath the force of her grip. Brody ran beside her, his stride long and powerful, yet measured so she could keep pace. His coat glistened under sheets of rain, his breaths visible in the cold air. Each flash of lightning etched his form as a guardian of flesh and spirit. They tore across the yard, past the white fence now streaked with water. Behind them, the Bennett house loomed, its perfect facade shaking under thunder and truth. No one followed. Not Robert, not Vanessa, not even Megan. Only her scream echoed faintly against the storm. Marie's lungs burned, her legs heavy with each step, but she pressed on. She clung to Brody's collar, her fingers buried in his soaked fur. Every time she faltered, the shepherd pulled her forward, his strength carrying her through the dark. Down Riverdale's streets, they ran past darkened windows and shuttered porches. The storm battered them both, but it could not drown out the pounding of Marie's heart. For the first time, she was running not from fear, but toward safety. When the glowing lights of the police station finally flickered into view through sheets of rain, Marie's legs nearly gave out with relief. She stumbled once, but Brody pressed against her side, keeping her upright until they reached the doors. She pushed them open, collapsing into the warmth of the lobby, her body trembling, water pooling at her feet. Brody shook himself once, then pressed close, his amber eyes fixed on her as though to remind her she was not alone. The lobby doors banged shut behind Marie as the storm's howl was cut off, replaced by the hum of fluorescent lights and the steady tick of the wall clock. Water streamed down her hair, her thin nightgown plastered to her small frame. She clutched Brody's collar with one hand, the damp X-ray envelope with the other. Her chest rose and fell in ragged bursts, every breath a fight against exhaustion. Brody stood planted at her side, his fur dripping puddles across the tiled floor, his eyes sweeping the room as if ready to defend her again at any moment. His presence filled the space, solid, certain a shield that had not wavered even in the storm. At the front desk, dispatcher Lily gasped, her chair scraping back. "Oh my God. Nick," she called, her voice echoing across the lobby. Nick Carter appeared from the corridor, his tall frame cutting a firm silhouette against the dim light. His eyes widened at the sight of the child collapsed on the floor, drenched and trembling. Brody pressed against her like a wall. His mug of coffee fell forgotten to the desk as he crossed the space in quick, heavy strides. "Marie," he breathed, kneeling beside her. His strong hands steadied her shoulders, but his voice softened to a gentleness she hadn't heard from anyone but him. "It's all right. You made it here." Her hazel eyes lifted wide and desperate. She gripped his collar with what little strength remained, the envelope still crushed in her fist. "She was going to hurt me," she whispered, her words trembling against his shirt. "I couldn't stay." Nick pulled her close, his arm firm around her fragile frame. She felt so light in his hold, her body shivering from the cold. But his embrace was steady as stone. "You're safe now," he said, each word a vow. "I promise you, nothing will touch you again." Brody circled once, then pressed close to both of them, his tail brushing against Marie's legs, his wet fur soaking Nick's sleeve. The shepherd let out a soft whine, lowering his head to nuzzle Marie's side. She buried her small hand into his thick coat, clinging to him, as though the storm still beat at her heels. Lily rushed forward with a blanket from the supply closet. "She's freezing," she murmured, draping it over the girl's shoulders. Marie's trembling slowed as warmth settled around her. Nick guided her to a bench, sitting close enough that his presence anchored her. Brody stretched out on the floor at her feet, his head resting on her lap. Marie bent forward, pressing her damp cheek against his fur, drawing strength from his steady warmth. For a moment, the room was quiet except for the storm still rattling faintly against the high windows. Relief hung thick in the air, heavy yet fragile, as if everyone inside understood the weight of what had just been prevented. Nick brushed a strand of wet hair from Marie's forehead. His voice was low, steady, but threaded with emotion. "You did the bravest thing tonight. You came here. You trusted us. That matters more than you know." Her lips parted, a whisper escaping. "I just didn't want to be invisible anymore." Nick swallowed against the tightness in his throat. He placed his hand gently on Brody's head, the coarse fur grounding him. "You're not invisible," he said. "Not anymore." The shepherd's tail thumped once firm as a seal to the promise. The storm outside raged on, but inside the station, a fragile peace had begun to form. Marie leaned against Nick's side, Brody's steady breathing filling the silence. For the first time in too long, she felt safe enough to close her eyes. The courthouse in Riverdale stood tall against the gray morning sky, its stone steps slick with rain from the night before. By dawn, the building had already drawn a crowd. Journalists clustered near the entrance, their cameras flashing. Families filled the benches inside, whispering with anticipation. The air hummed with tension, the kind that builds when truth is about to be tested under oath. Nick walked through the heavy wooden doors with Marie at his side. She wore a simple white dress and cardigan, her small frame dwarfed by the cavernous hall. Her hand clutched Brody's leash, though it was clear the shepherd was the one guiding her forward. His stride was calm, his amber eyes sweeping the room as if measuring every soul within it. When they entered the courtroom, a hush fell over the crowd. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every gaze turned toward the little girl who had carried an X-ray through a storm, and the dog who now walked beside her like a shadow. Nick's steady presence flanked them, his posture strong but protective. He guided Marie to the prosecution's table, Brody settling at her feet with the grace of a sentinel. The shepherd stretched out, his body curled protectively near the child's chair. At the front, Judge Ellison presided, her sharp gaze sweeping the room before striking the gavel once. Order. The prosecution began. Assistant District Attorney Marquez rose, her voice clear, precise. She held up the X-ray in its plastic sleeve, the same one Marie had clutched in the storm. This, she said, her words echoing across the chamber, is the truth a child carried into a police station because no one else would protect her. 2 fractured ribs. Not from a fall, not from a stumble, from blunt force trauma. She laid the image on the evidence screen where it glowed larger than life. The jagged white lines across the tiny ribs silenced even the most skeptical onlookers. Marquez continued, her tone building with quiet fire. She described the locked door, the broken chair, the blood-stained cloth, the notebook filled with rehearsed lies. Piece by piece, she rebuilt the picture of a house that had hidden cruelty behind its white gate. Nick sat beside Marie, his presence steady. He glanced at her occasionally, offering reassurance without words. Each time Brody's tail brushed lightly against her foot, a silent anchor in the storm of eyes watching her. On the opposite side, the Bennetts sat together, Robert in his stiff gray suit, shoulders heavy, Vanessa clutching her purse as if it might shield her, Megan, composed lips pressed into a faint, brittle smile. Their attorney leaned in, whispering strategies, but their faces betrayed unease under the mounting evidence. Marquez called her first witness. Dr. Caldwell, the physician who had examined Marie, took the stand. He spoke with calm authority, pointing to the X-ray. The fractures are consistent with direct impact. A fall downstairs would scatter the injury. This is targeted, deliberate. Murmurs rippled through the room. Vanessa's eyes flicked nervously toward the gallery. Robert rubbed his temple with a trembling hand. Nick's pen moved quietly across his notebook, recording every detail, though his focus remained on Marie. She sat still, small hands pressed into Brody's fur. The shepherd lifted his head, once resting his chin on her lap, amber eyes scanning the courtroom as if daring anyone to challenge her. The gavel struck again. Judge Ellison's voice cut through the murmurs. Proceed. Marquez closed her opening with words that hung in the air like a verdict of their own. This case is about a child's truth buried under a family's lies. Today, those lies will be stripped away. The courtroom air grew denser as Megan was called to the stand. She rose from her seat with practiced calm, smoothing the fabric of her blouse as though it mattered. Her long dark hair was tied neatly back, her eyes cool and steady. When she sat, her posture was rigid, her faint smile fixed like porcelain. The defense attorney stepped forward first, his tone smooth. Megan, people have made serious claims about you. Did you ever harm your sister, Marie? Her voice was clear, unshaken. No, I never hurt her. She makes things up when she wants attention. That's all this is? The lawyer nodded, satisfied, and turned to the jury. But Megan's gaze stayed forward, unblinking. When the prosecutor Marquez approached, her voice cut sharper. Marie's ribs were broken. How do you explain that? Megan's smile held, though her fingers twisted once in her lap before she stilled them. She falls a lot. She's clumsy. It isn't my fault if she trips. Murmurs stirred through the gallery, but Marquez pressed on her hand, resting lightly on the notebook of evidence. So, these fractures confirmed by Dr. Caldwell as deliberate blows were accidents, yes. Megan replied simply, her tone unyielding. Across the aisle, Vanessa leaned forward in her seat, her face tight with strain. "It's true," she interjected suddenly, her voice high. "Marie is imaginative, fragile. She has always exaggerated. We've tried to help her. We're good parents," Robert added with a stiff nod, his voice low but rehearsed. "Children fight. They bruise. Families manage things privately. There was no crime here." The gallery rippled again with uneasy whispers. Judge Ellison rapped the gavel once. "Order." Marquez lifted the slim notebook Ruiz had uncovered from the locked room. "Let me ask this, then," she said, her voice calm but edged. "Why does your family keep a written record of accidents that never happened? Falls from stairs, trips on rugs, slips in bathtubs, entry after entry, all in your mother's handwriting. No family tracks pain with this kind of precision, unless they are preparing lies in advance." Vanessa's face drained of color. Her lips opened, but no words came. Robert shifted uncomfortably, his gaze lowering to the table. Marquez set the notebook down with deliberate force. "And then there's this," she said, holding up the blood-stained fabric Brody had uncovered. The fragment of a child's shirt, pink once, but dulled with dust and streaked with dried blood. The jury leaned forward silent, their eyes fixed on the evidence that spoke louder than any denial. Dr. Caldwell, recalled briefly, confirmed the match. "The stain is consistent with injury. The fibers matched children's clothing of Marie's size." The weight of his words pressed hard against the defense's fragile wall. Vanessa closed her eyes, her shoulders shaking with the strain of maintaining her story. Robert's silence thickened into defeat. Megan, however, sat with her back straight, her brittle smile still clinging to her lips. Yet Nick, watching closely, saw it falter when Brody shifted on the courtroom floor. The shepherd lifted his head, pressing his chin once more into Marie's lap. His amber eyes locked on the girl in the witness chair. The simple gesture, a loyal dog grounding a fragile child, cut through the room with more power than any argument. Marie's small hand stroked his head, her touch steady despite the weight of eyes upon her. She did not speak. She did not need to. Brody's presence filled the silence with a truth no one could deny. The jury turned back to Megan. Her faint smile trembled, cracking at the edges. The gavel struck again, Judge Ellison's voice commanding, "Proceed." And with that, the last of the Bennett's defenses began to crumble piece by piece under the weight of undeniable truth. The courtroom had grown so quiet that even the shuffle of papers echoed against the walls. Judge Ellison's sharp gaze swept the room, her silver hair glinting in the light above. The jury foreperson rose a folded paper, trembling slightly in her hand. Nick glanced at Marie. She sat still, small and pale, her hand resting on Brody's head. The shepherd's eyes followed the movements at the front, as if he too understood the weight of what was about to be spoken. The foreperson cleared her throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Megan Bennett, guilty of assault." Gasps rippled through the gallery, though no one dared break the solemn silence that followed. The foreperson continued, her voice steadier now. "We also find Robert Bennett and Vanessa Bennett guilty of obstruction of justice and of willfully concealing evidence of abuse." Judge Ellison nodded, her voice firm and final. "The verdict is entered into record. Sentencing will follow under state statute." At once the fragile wall of denial collapsed. Vanessa dropped her head into her hands, her shoulders shaking as though her body had finally betrayed her resolve. Robert sat slumped, staring blankly at the floor, as if the weight of silence he had carried all these years had finally crushed him. Megan's brittle smile was gone. Her face drained of color, her jaw-tight eyes darting wildly, as if searching for a way to slip free of judgment. But there was none. The truth had found her, and it would not let go. Marie pressed her lips together, her hazel eyes filling with tears. Not tears of fear, not anymore. These were tears of release, the kind that come when a burden too heavy for small shoulders is finally lifted. She bent forward, burying her face into Brody's thick fur. The shepherd shifted, pressing his head into her lap. His amber eyes half closed. A long sigh escaped him, deep and steady, as though even he understood the meaning of the moment. His breath warmed Marie's trembling hands, grounding her in a way nothing else could. Nick watched the scene, his throat tightening. He had seen verdicts delivered before, but never had one carried this kind of weight. This was not just about guilt or innocence. It was about a child who had been silenced, finally being heard. Assistant District Attorney Marquez closed her folder quietly, her expression one of satisfaction laced with relief. She glanced at Marie, offering the faintest of nods as if to say, "You did this. Your truth won." Judge Ellison struck the gavel once more. Court adjourned. The sound echoed like thunder, but this time it brought no fear. It was the sound of justice landing solid and final. In the gallery, people whispered softly, some wiping their eyes. A few reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. But none of it touched the moment unfolding at the prosecution's table. Marie lifted her head slowly, her cheeks damp. She turned toward Nick, her lips quivering into something almost foreign on her face, a small trembling smile. Nick reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. "It's over," he said softly. "You're free now." Brody's tail brushed against the floor, slow and steady, as though sealing the promise. Marie leaned into the shepherd again, wrapping her arms around his neck. This time her tears carried no shadows, only light breaking through after too long in darkness. 2 weeks after the verdict, Marie stepped out of Nick's cruiser with Brody close at her side. The road curved gently into a quiet neighborhood on the edge of Riverdale, where the houses stood farther apart and the fields stretched wide beneath the afternoon sun. Ahead of her rose the Morrison house. It was built of warm yellow timber, the paint faded gently by years of sun. Yet it seemed to glow against the sky. White curtains fluttered at the windows, and a wooden swing swayed lazily on the front porch. Around the yard, flowers bloomed in careful beds. Roses near the steps, daisies and marigolds further out. A breeze carried their scent, mingling with the earthy smell of cut grass. Marvin Morrison came out first. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his beard peppered with gray. His eyes, though serious at first glance, softened as they met Marie's. Behind him walked his wife Evelyn, a woman with warm brown skin and gentle lines around her mouth that deepened when she smiled. She carried a basket of apples, as if welcoming guests was simply part of her rhythm. "Hello, sweetheart," Evelyn said softly. Crouching so her gaze met Marie's. "We've been waiting for you." Marie clutched Brody's collar tighter, her body half hidden behind his frame. Her hazel eyes flickered from Evelyn to Marvin, then back to the safety of the shepherd's amber gaze. Nick stepped forward, his voice calm. "Marie, this is the Morrison family. They're here to give you a home, a safe one." Evelyn extended her hand. "No rush," she said gently. "You can take your time." For a long moment, Marie didn't move. The weight of the past still clung to her shoulders, heavier than the small suitcase she carried. Then Brody pressed forward, nudging her hand with his nose. His tail swished once, slow and encouraging. Marie blinked, then reached out tentatively, placing her small hand into Evelyn's. The woman's touch was warm, her grip light but steady. A faint flicker of relief passed over Marie's face. Marvin placed a hand on the porch railing. "We've set up a room for you," he said. "It looks out over the garden. And Brody is welcome here always." At that, Brody let out a short huff, as though sealing the arrangement himself. Inside, the house smelled faintly of pine wood and cinnamon. A quilt lay folded at the end of the staircase, and photographs of the Morrison children, now grown, hung along the walls. Marie walked slowly through the hallway, her eyes cautious but curious. Her room waited upstairs, painted in soft cream. A small bed stood beneath the window, its quilt patterned with sunflowers. On the sill, a berma held fresh daisies. Outside, she could see the swing swaying gently in the evening breeze. She stood in the doorway, hesitant. Brody brushed past her, leaping onto the rug with ease, circling once, before settling with a satisfied sigh. His presence filled the space with a sense of ownership, as if telling her it was safe to claim. Marie placed her suitcase at the foot of the bed. She didn't open it, not yet. Instead, she walked over to Brody and sank to the floor, pressing her face into his damp fur. The shepherd's tail thumped slow and steady, his breathings a rhythm of reassurance. Downstairs, Evelyn called softly, "Dinner will be ready soon. No hurry, sweetheart. Come when you're ready." Marie glanced at the doorway, then at the window where the garden stretched wide and alive. For the first time in memory, she felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Possibility. She looked at Brody, whispering almost too softly to hear, "Maybe this can be home." The shepherd's amber eyes closed, his chest rising with a steady breath as if agreeing. The days passed slowly, each one lighter than the last. Marie began to move through the Morrison home with steps less cautious, her laughter breaking through the silence in soft fragments. She sat on the porch swing in the mornings, Brody lying beneath her feet, while Evelyn tended to her flowers and Marvin worked in his shed. Nick visited often, his cruiser pulling up the dirt lane in the late afternoons. He no longer came in his uniform, but in a worn jacket. The lines of his face softened when he saw her. Brody would bound down the steps to greet him, tail sweeping the air like a banner of loyalty before trotting back to Marie's side. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rose, Nick joined them on the porch. The swing creaked gently as Marie sat with her legs tucked beneath her. Brody stretched along the wooden boards at her feet. His eyes were half-closed ears, twitching at the distant call of cicadas. Nick leaned against the railing, the light catching on the faint silver at his temples. "You've settled in well," he said softly. Marie nodded, her hazel eyes glimmering in the golden light. "It feels different here," she whispered. "Quiet, safe." Brody shifted, letting out a low sigh, his chest rising with the rhythm of contentment. Marie reached down, running her fingers through his thick fur, then looked back at Nick. "Do you remember?" she asked hesitantly, "when I said I didn't want to be invisible anymore?" Nick's throat tightened. He remembered every word. He crouched beside her, resting his hand gently on the porch rail near hers. "Yes," he said. "I remember." Marie hesitated, then slid her small hand into his. Her fingers were cool, but they curled with quiet trust around his calloused palm. Her voice trembled, but the words carried a strength beyond her years. "Now I'm safe." The moment hung in the air, wrapped in the glow of sunset. Nick's eyes blurred, though he kept his voice steady. "Yes, Marie, you are safe, and you always will be." Brody lifted his head briefly, as if in approval, then settled back down, pressing his body closer to Marie's feet. His tail brushed the boards once before stilling, and a long, steady sigh left him. Content, protective, final. The porch filled with quiet, the hum of cicadas, the soft creak of the swing, the steady rhythm of the shepherd's breathing. Evelyn's voice floated from the kitchen window, warm and gentle. "Supper's ready whenever you are." Marie smiled faintly, her hand still in Nick's. For the first time, the smile reached her eyes, fully unshadowed by fear. She looked out at the horizon, where the sky melted into the glow of evening, and allowed herself to imagine tomorrow without dread. Nick stayed there hand in hand, with her Brody sprawled at their side. The three of them, child officer and shepherd, bound together not by blood, but by something deeper, loyalty, justice, and love, unspoken, yet unbreakable. The sun slipped lower, gilding the porch in soft firelight. Brody's eyes closed fully now, his chest rising in slow, even breaths. The shepherd seemed to understand that his task for the moment was complete. And as the last rays touched the house of yellow wood, Marie leaned against Nick's shoulder, whispering once more, softer, but certain I'm safe. The world beyond the porch still carried storms and shadows. But here in the hush of twilight, justice, love, and loyalty had found one another. And for a fragile child, that was enough to begin again. Marie's journey reminds us that truth once spoken can break even the strongest chains of silence. Her courage, Nick's quiet strength, and Brody's unwavering loyalty came together to turn fear into freedom. What began as a fragile step into a police station on a stormy night became a story of justice, healing, and new beginnings. At the heart of it all stood Brody, the German shepherd whose instincts, devotion, and presence gave a child the strength to speak. German shepherds have long been known as guardians, trusted partners to police rescue teams and families alike. But beyond their strength lies something even greater: their ability to sense human pain, to offer comfort when words fail, and to stand firm when darkness closes in. Brody's story is not just about a dog protecting a child. It is a testament to the unconditional love and loyalty that animals gift us. This tale leaves us with a reminder: compassion matters. Justice matters. Listening to the smallest voices matters. But so too does the bond between humans and animals. A bond capable of guiding us through storms, both real and unseen. For Marie, it was the steady heartbeat of a German shepherd that turned despair into courage and loneliness into belonging. As the sun set over her new home with Brody stretched at her side, the message was clear: safety is possible, healing is real, and love, whether from people or the loyal eyes of a dog, has the power to restore hope. May this story inspire us to cherish animals as companions, guardians, and healers of the heart, and to nurture the kindness within ourselves, to protect those who cannot always protect themselves.